Today I'm really excited to flip through my art journal with you. This is something I talked about in my last video and I shared the process of making it, but I wanted to spend a little bit more time just flipping through each page and talking to you about the design elements and what I learned along the way and things that you can implement in your art practice and specifically in making your own art journal. So I should basically start when looking at the cover and say that a lot of the pages are basically from Vogue magazine, which is something that I have a subscription to. So I always have Vogue magazine pages lying around and I'm really inspired by fashion. So that is going to be one of the design aspects. So in the cover, it's basically a combination of a statue from an editorial that was shot in New York City and a graphic macro photo of the inside of a flower. And then I found something that said The Secret History, and I thought that was kind of like really fun, even though I've shared this entire process on my YouTube. So it's pretty much the opposite of a secret at this point, but I still think it's kind of fun because I think that is the idea of art journaling, is that it should be sort of your own secret history in the sense that it's a documentation of your internal life rather than your external life. And the back of the cover also has a piece of the New York City editorial as well as the flower. And so you can't really maybe see here, but I did a little bit of doodling along the black parts of the cover, which actually segues into the interior cover, which again, this one says Yes to New, and I worked on this between August of 2023 through May of 2024, and so that was a transitional time for me. So the Yes to New was definitely very apropos here. And in this case, I believe the pages were already gray, so I just sort of added some of these doodles of plants and stuff like that, and the collage elements. And I kind of like that this has a little bit of a tropical vibe, but it's still sort of gray and black, so there's sort of a chicness to that. And you know, this just goes to show that this is part of figuring out your own style, you know, just figuring out how to fill pages. Like, what would you fill it with? You probably would have done something completely different. And so that is really where this starts to help you figure out your own unique style. It really is just a matter of constraints and, you know, these are the pages. What are you going to do with them on that particular day? And it also speaks to your mood. And so these next pages, which are very wrinkled, but again, these are the first pages that I sort of worked on. So at the same time, this was definitely me troubleshooting the process and whatnot. But this was a Dolce & Gabbana ad, which I thought was really sexy and fun. And the crown was kind of giving storybook, like princess vibes. So that I thought was interesting. And then there was a Karl Lagerfeld tribute in Vogue magazine where I pulled this other page from. And then this is one of the first lessons that I started to learn. I was this page, which is very busy and very messy, I just spent too much time on, and I think that's the first lesson I learned about art journaling. It's that you have a lot of pages, so you don't need to fill every page up with paint or doodles and whatnot. And I'll show you what this page looked like with just the collage elements, just so that you could see that it looked a lot better before I started doodling and painting over it. So that was kind of an early lesson that I was really happy about. And then this portrait drawing, again, it's nothing, you know, crazy. I kind of liked the idea of trying to fit a profile portrait that looked a little bit old school, so I used an olive color. But, you know, ultimately I sort of realized that portrait painting and portrait drawing was something that was probably better for a larger medium. So, you know, even though again here I do have another portrait, it was more just because that's what I was doing in terms of painting at the time. And I think these first few pages were really my learning curve about what I could and should do in my art journal versus in other places. And this editorial I love. It has like the, you know, the wide leg jean trend, which this was probably from 2021, 22 in Vogue. So it just goes to show how trends, you know, really become saturated. And this is the bottom part of this figure. So it was kind of also interesting that when I first started, I sort of had two pieces of that editorial on two different pages. This is again a little bit more of a modern like line drawing take on, it's actually painting, but it's sort of like a more modern take on a really minimalistic portrait, you know, nothing too crazy. This was one of the original design elements that I added, which was a screen print that I did probably in 2020. And it was kind of cool, but I wish I had learned image transfer before, because that really would have incorporated the actual page a little bit better. So that's something that I sort of take note of now. And I'm sort of happy that I learned that technique, you know, because now moving forward, I could definitely apply that to my art journaling. Then this is again just kind of like an interesting little page. This doodle page is just something that I did with acrylic and ink, and you know, it wasn't really anything I gave too much thought of, but when I've shown people my art journal, they always seem to gravitate toward this page, which for me, it kind of looks like a mess. So I think that that's an interesting aspect of this whole process, that one person's messy page is another person's, you know, interesting page. And then these two pages, even though they're toward the beginning, I did toward the end of the process, and they really do kind of give me like middle school composition book, which I actually thought was fun at the time. Again, it's a little bit messy, a little bit all over the place. I liked the wildish thing. I thought that was a fun play on words, and I kind of loved the boots, but you know, nothing I would necessarily write home about, but glad I did it. And I think a lot of these pages, it just really, the lesson learned is just that, you know, you learn so much so quickly from one project, that is why I think that it helps you find your artistic voice and style so effectively. And this is a photo of Tuscany from an editorial. And then this page is actually one of those messy pages that turns out, in my case, turned out being something that I really liked. It was really just a bunch of floral doodles that I just wasn't happy about. I didn't like the colors I used, so I took a palette knife and started scraping acrylic paints over it, kind of as a color study. And then I had this image of Gigi Hadid wearing a bunch of clothes on her head, and I don't even know anything about the editorial, but I know that I kind of really like this page, and that's really the only thing that matters. This was actually original to the first flip through, where this picture of Billie Eilish was on the back of something that I was working on. So a collage element from an earlier collage. And then when it fell down on the table, I noticed that Billie Eilish was in the back, and the cut was kind of interesting and unintentional. And those are both things that I really value in art. And I really wanted to keep a couple pages as close to the original novel as possible, so that I kind of always have a reference for what this would have looked like had I not done anything. And then these pages are another good example of sort of discovering your style. This is, I really wasn't sure how cohesive this was going to be. I kind of liked this, you know, cow image, but it looked so country and so different from everything else that I was like, how does this make sense? And somehow when I put these this was like a continuous line drawing, and I doodled over the cow, and you know, it was not something I thought too much about at all, but I think that is what made it a little bit more cohesive. And the doodling is kind of what made it, you know, more my style. And then this is actually a practice painting. I was testing colors for abstract expressionist painting that I was gonna make. I didn't even end up making the painting, but I'm really glad that I did this, because at least I have a documentation of the idea of the painting and the design aesthetic that I wanted to go with. So in that sense, even though I didn't make the painting, it's just a great example of the fact that the art journal is kind of a good place to put your ideas, you know, because you never know, I could sort of decide to make that painting tomorrow and I still have that guide and I know what those colors look like together and everything. And then this page is just an editorial of Cara Delevignes, and I liked that her legs looked and feet kind of looked huge here, so it almost looked like Gulliver's Travels, like a giant in a field. And this was a Chanel editorial with Kristen Stewart. She's holding a falcon, and it was pretty cool. I'm not sure exactly how I ended up with the design of the foliage and the trees cut out in that way, but I can only assume that I was probably cutting out branding or something that I didn't necessarily want to have in the book. But again, sort of those creative constraints make you end up coming up with things that you may not have had you just had, you know, a blank page to work with. And then this is another experiment for paintings. In this case, it would have been kind of a diptych with two different snake paintings. And again, I didn't end up making this painting. I don't actually love the colors, but I had to sort of experiment with the colors because they were in my head. So this is a really good example of how, you know, you experiment with things and maybe you won't do that exactly the same way, but you know now that you don't want to maybe use those colors. But I would use the design of the snakes, and I experimented with snake shapes ahead as well, and that's kind of a theme of that time. So I would actually use these snake shapes again, but maybe just a different background. Then these pages are actually a couple of my favorite. This page started completely just, I wanted to journal, and so I just started playing around with messy lines and small little doodles. And, you know, some of the areas of the page came out just ugly, so I just I pasted some screen print pieces over it, kind of giving it a little bit more of a unique aesthetic. There was this little luck thing that I pulled out of a magazine, and this image of a peacock, I had originally worked with pastel over it, and I didn't really like the way pastel worked within this book. It was just a little bit too porous and messy. I love working with pastel and charcoal, but I realized quickly that this wasn't the right place for it. And I think that was another lesson that I learned, that there's a time and a place for all of your ideas. And in this case, pastel wasn't something I wanted to really go too deep into in this case. This is just a collage with the Burberry Hero ad with Adam Driver. And I sort of added the word epic here and the Coco Chanel branding just to sort of give it a fun little superhero, you know, feminine edge, and just play with that look. And then this is another example of me experimenting with snake shapes. I just love the fluidity of a snake's body. So I was just trying to play around with different ways that I can sort of draw snakes or paint snakes. And then this page is actually really interesting because it was more performative than anything else. I was, again, experimenting with colors. In this case, it was olive green and gold, and another more turquoise green. And so basically what I did for this page was I took a palette knife and I just started smacking it with these colors, and I recorded a short with it, which was actually my most popular short for this entire art journal, which is really interesting because when you look at the page isn't really interesting, so it wouldn't be one of my favorite pages. But I think just the idea of seeing me just, you know, smacking the page with the paint was satisfying. And that is something that I really learned about this process too, that, you know, there's things that are interesting about art for different reasons. And so the aesthetic aspect I'm not crazy about, but the process was interesting enough to me and a few people on YouTube. And then this page, a Banana Republic ad, I loved the aesthetic, and I wish I had done an image transfer to incorporate the back of the page, but nonetheless, it really did help inform a little bit of the natural aesthetic compared with the more metro urban aesthetic that here you could sort of see on this page. This is from the same editorial as the cover images. And so I actually did this almost toward the end. And so I was really happy that I found this. The plunge is kind of funny. It almost has like a sinister aspect to it. And these are drawings from Vogue of mushrooms that were part of an editorial about maybe a documentary about mushrooms. I'm not sure. But I kind of thought this page is one of my favorite collage pages. I'm not even sure why. I just like the natural with the, you know, metropolitan aesthetic and kind of like a little bit of the grunge and the plunge and the play on words. It was kind of cool. This is actually another one of my favorite pages. Right now it's kind of messy and wrinkled, but you know, the horse and the woman and the jewelry, I did some research to try and find out where this came from, and I honestly couldn't find anything. So if you have any idea, please let me know. But again, just a really great picture that I really just wanted to hold on to. And this was a good example actually of not overdoing it. So in the beginning, this is having an interesting collage that I completely ruined by overdoing it. And then this is a perfect example of this looks good, leave it alone. And so I think that was a perfect takeaway from this process. And then this is a McQueen editorial that I've used in a lot of different places, including my current sketchbook. And in this case, I'm kind of not mad at the composition with the black and white doodles. So, you know, that was cool. Then this is another experiment that I did on YouTube where I played Beyonce's song Tyrant, and I just had the marker on the paper, and as the violin started going, I started moving with the music. And so again, I'm not necessarily crazy about the aesthetic of this page, but it made for a fun short form video, which I was really happy with. So this is another example of the process maybe being more interesting than the final product. And then this Michael Kors collage over that McQueen, oh my God, literally just spit on this. So this Michael Kors image, I thought it was cool. The guy had kind of like a feminine aesthetic. And so that when I added over this McQueen background with the flowers and stuff, and I actually did it in 2020 and I had it framed, and I think I took it to pop-ups and stuff like that, but then I didn't want to lose it or get rid of it, so I pasted it into here, and I'm really happy I did because I kind of always liked that collage. Then these are just a couple collage elements I decided to add toward the end so that these pages wouldn't be blank. And this was from Paris. I'm not sure if this was the Karl Lagerfeld editorial, but you know, one last kind of like the last page. I thought that was kind of fun. Then this is a Casamigos ad that I just doodled over, and that's pretty much it. And you know, again, I think that the biggest takeaway from this whole thing is that you don't have to figure everything out in the beginning. It does take time to figure out your unique style, and it really does come from, I would say, being a little bit spontaneous, being experimental, being improvisational, and not really judging yourself. I think the interesting thing about calling this my secret history is that it is secret, you know, at the moment. So you don't have to share anything that you work on your art journal, even if you are adding it to your socials and sharing it, you know. And I think that it does give you the space not to judge yourself. And I think that's where your best work comes from. And then it also gives you the gift of having something that you will always have that is visual, that nobody needs to understand what you were going through at any point in time while you were making this, but they could still probably relate or find a page that they like, or maybe things that they don't like. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that it doesn't really matter, because I was happy with it when I did it, and it's not going to be in any gallery anywhere. It's all it's going to be is sitting either on my bookshelf or in my closet, but it is something that I can go back to and draw inspiration from. And I have valuable lessons that I really would not have learned had I not embarked on this process. So I'm really happy to be able to sort of share a proper flip through of this entire journal with you, and I hope you liked it. And I would love for you to share your experience with art journaling, doodling, or anything that you do to both express yourself artistically and also develop your own unique artistic style.